If these relics are so sacred, why can't anyone touch them? This is one of those questions that the more you think about it, the more uncomfortable it becomes, because we're talking about objects that, theoretically, represent the faith of millions of people around the world, relics that should bring the faithful closer to history, to spirituality, to the very origin of the belief. And yet, many of them remain hidden, isolated, protected by rigid rules that almost no one fully understands. What's behind all this? Over the centuries, the Vatican has become one of the most mysterious places on the planet, a territory surrounded not only by physical walls, but by silence, secrecy, and extremely restricted access. Inside, there are secret archives, sealed vaults, and forbidden areas where some of the most valuable and controversial relics in the history of the Church are kept. And the most intriguing thing is not just what's inside, but who can, and who cannot, get close. Because here begins a contradiction that is difficult to ignore. If these relics are part of the history of faith, why aren't they accessible to the faithful themselves? If they are sacred symbols, why is contact with them limited to such a small group of people? And more importantly, is this really about preservation, or is there something that simply cannot be displayed? Many people accept the official explanation: protection against damage, historical preservation, security. And in part, that makes sense. After all, we're talking about ancient, fragile objects, some over 1,000 years old. But the more you observe this system, the more questions arise that aren't so easy to answer. Because we're not just talking about museum display cases, we're talking about relics that no one can touch, objects that almost no one sees, pieces that in some cases are only accessed under extremely specific circumstances, and sometimes not even then. There are items that have remained out of reach for centuries, others that were removed from circulation without clear explanations, and some that simply disappeared from public view as if they had never existed. And this is exactly where things start to get stranger, because if the goal were simply to preserve, protection would suffice. But when something is simultaneously sacred, valuable, and inaccessible, it raises another possibility, a possibility that many people prefer not to consider. What if the problem isn't the risk of damaging these relics, but the risk of someone questioning them? Throughout history, many of these pieces have been involved in debates, doubts, and even accusations of lack of authenticity. There are experts who question their origins, dates, materials, and even the context in which certain relics emerged. And yet many continue to be treated as untouchable symbols, both in the physical sense and in the sense of being questioned. This creates a curious scenario. The more important the relic seems to be, the less access it allows, and the more restricted the access and the greater the feeling that there is something that is not being fully shown. But perhaps the most unsettling question isn't about the relics themselves. Perhaps it's about what happens when no one can get close enough to verify, question, or even fully understand what is being protected. Because from the moment something becomes untouchable, it also becomes unquestionable. And that's precisely what brings us to the first case. One of the most symbolic, most protected relics, and at the same time one of those that raises the most questions to this day. And before we continue, let me ask you a sincere question. Because this kind of topic isn't just about history, it's about perception. Do you also feel that there's something strange about all of this? The more we look at these relics, the more it seems there's an artificial distance between what is sacred and those who truly believe. If this has ever crossed your mind, I'd love to know. Comment below. Do you think these relics are being protected or hidden? Because this type of doubt is what truly drives this investigation. And if this topic captivates you precisely because of that, because it mixes faith, mystery, and things that seem to make no sense, then give it a like now. It may seem simple, but this shows that this type of content needs to continue being explored, unfiltered, without fear of questioning. And if you want to delve deeper into this type of story, the ones that almost no one explains properly, the ones that always leave you with a feeling of something's wrong here, subscribe to the channel, because in the next videos, we're going to go even deeper into this universe of secrets, contradictions, and things that remain beyond the reach of most. Now, come back with me, because the relic you are about to see is not only one of the most important ever preserved, it is also one of the most inaccessible, and perhaps one of the most questioned in all of history. The first relic that enters this story is not just an ancient object kept somewhere far away. For many, it is one of the most symbolic pieces of the entire Christian faith, and precisely for that reason, it is perhaps also one of the most shrouded in silence rules and a level of restriction that draws the attention even of those who have never stopped to think about this subject. We are talking about something that, according to tradition, is directly linked to the origins of the Church itself, something that carries enormous spiritual weight, but which at the same time remains distant, almost unattainable. It is not the type of relic you find on ordinary display, nor something that visitors can easily observe. On the contrary, access is extremely limited, controlled, and in many cases only permitted under very specific conditions. And that's where the trouble begins. Because when you hear about this relic, everything seems to make sense until you realize how well protected it is. Not just physically protected, but shrouded in a kind of invisible barrier where information, access, and even questions seem carefully filtered. At first glance, the explanation seems simple. Preserve, protect from damage, avoid contact that could compromise its integrity. And yes, that's part of it. But the more you observe the context surrounding this relic, the more you realize it's not just about conservation. There is something more to it than that. This piece is not only ancient, it is symbolic, sensitive, and in a way controversial. Over the years, it has been associated with stories, interpretations, and versions that do not always coincide. There are records, accounts, and even debates among scholars trying to understand its true origin, its journey through the centuries, and above all, whether it is exactly what they say it is. And yet, she remains there, untouchable, not only in the physical sense but also in the sense of questioning, because there's a huge difference between something being protected and something being kept out of reach. And when that line starts to get blurred, questions arise that aren't so easy to ignore. Who decided that this relic should be inaccessible? At what point did it cease to be a shared symbol and become something restricted to a select few? And more importantly, what exactly would happen if she were completely exposed? These questions don't arise by chance. They emerge because there's a pattern that repeats itself when we talk about certain relics. The greater the symbolic value, the greater the level of restriction, the more central it is to the faith, the more distant it seems to be from the people who believe in it. And that creates a feeling that's hard to ignore. There's a feeling that there's a layer to the story that isn't fully accessible, as if we're only seeing the surface, while what really matters remains hidden at a deeper level. And perhaps the most intriguing thing about all this is realizing that this relic is not an isolated case. It's just the gateway. Because when you start investigating other pieces, other objects, other records, you realize that this pattern repeats itself in even more intense ways, involving even more controversial relics, even more poorly explained histories, and levels of access that go far beyond what seems reasonable. But before we get into that, I want to propose something simple, almost symbolic. If at any point in this video you feel that something here doesn't make sense, or that this story raises more questions than it answers, comment below with the word hidden. It's not just a comment, it's a way of highlighting that point, of showing that you too have noticed that there's something beyond what's being shown. And now, pay attention to what comes next. Because this next relic not only follows that same pattern, it takes it to a whole different level. If the first relic already seemed surrounded by silence and restriction, the next one takes that feeling to a level that starts to become truly unsettling. Because here, we're no longer just talking about a symbolic object or an item linked to tradition. We're talking about something that, for many, could completely change how certain stories are understood. A relic that draws attention not only for what it represents, but for the level of control that exists around it. And that's exactly what makes it all the stranger. Unlike the previous one, this one is not only inaccessible, it's practically invisible. It doesn't appear in common exhibitions, it's not part of guided tours, and in many cases its existence isn't even clearly mentioned. It's associated with records, documents, and interpretations that have spanned centuries, and that even today remain beyond the reach of most. And when something is so difficult to access, the first question that inevitably arises is, why? Once again, the official explanation revolves around preservation, historical sensitivity, and the need for control. But here, that justification begins to lose strength, because we're not just talking about physical fragility, we're talking about information, about content, about something that could be analyzed, studied, questioned, and yet it remains closed. There's a silent pattern here, a pattern that repeats itself when the subject involves more sensitive, more controversial relics, those closer to points that could generate debate. The greater the potential for questioning, the greater the level of isolation, and this raises a possibility that many people avoid facing. What if some of these relics are not only being protected from time, but from people? Over the years, theories, independent investigations, and even accounts from scholars who have attempted to access this type of material have emerged. Some say they have found inconsistencies. Others claim that certain versions of the story simply do not hold up when compared with older documents. And there are still those who believe that entire parts of the narrative have been adjusted, reinterpreted, or even omitted. But that's not the most curious point. What's really striking is that, even with so many doubts, access remains restricted, as if questioning weren't part of the process, but something to be avoided. And here's a detail that almost no one notices. When a relic is visible, it can be interpreted in various ways. It can be analyzed, discussed, even challenged. But when it is invisible and when it is out of reach, it becomes something fixed, unquestionable, almost immutable, not because it has been proven, but because it cannot be confronted. And that completely changes the game, because it ceases to be merely about faith, tradition, or history, and becomes about narrative control, about who decides what can be seen, what can be touched, and most importantly, what can be questioned. And the more you think about it, the more you realize that the problem isn't just the existence of these relics, but the way they are preserved. Because if everything were clear, open, accessible, this level of doubt wouldn't exist. But it exists, and it grows precisely where access decreases. Now think about it with me for a second. If such relics already exist, virtually invisible, surrounded by silence, and beyond the reach even of scholars, what else might be hidden within this same system? What else follows this pattern, but on an even larger scale? Because what comes next doesn't just involve one object, it involves a whole set of records that, according to many, hold answers to questions that have never been fully clarified. And that's precisely where the story starts to get even deeper. If it already seemed like there was a pattern of concealment up to this point, what comes next expands that to a level that completely changes the perspective, because we are no longer talking about a specific relic. We are talking about an entire set of records that, together, form something much larger, a kind of secret memory of the Church itself, a place where there are not only objects, but documents, accounts, decisions, and information that have spanned centuries without ever being fully exposed to the public. And that changes everything, because while a relic can be questioned about its origin, an archive can be questioned about what it reveals. And that's precisely why the level of restriction here is even more intense. These records are linked to extremely controlled areas, accessible only by direct authorization and often only to a very select group of people. Historians, researchers, and scholars have tried over time to access parts of this content, and many report the same thing: limited access, controlled time, and, in some cases, total denial without a clear explanation. And when information is controlled in this way, doubt automatically grows, because documents are not just old pieces of paper. They tell stories, they record decisions, they reveal versions that often do not coincide with what has been officially transmitted over time. And this is where everything starts to take on a different significance, because if there are records that have been kept for centuries, what exactly do they say? Do they confirm everything that has already been taught? Or do they reveal details that would completely change how certain stories are understood today? This is the part that bothers me the most, because unlike a physical relic, which can be venerated regardless of its authenticity, a document can be analyzed, compared, and challenged. It can generate new interpretations, raise contradictions, and open debates that may never have been fully resolved. And perhaps that's precisely why so much remains out of sight. There is a silent pattern that is beginning to emerge more clearly now. Symbolic relics are protected. Controversial relics are restricted. But records are controlled because they have the power to rearrange entire narratives. And the more you think about it, the more you realize it's not just about hiding objects, but about limiting access to the interpretation of history itself. And that leads to an even deeper question. Whoever controls the past also controls how the present understands faith. Over the years, reports have emerged of documents that remained unseen for centuries. Letters, records of decisions, accounts of events, that, if confirmed, could raise new discussions about events considered closed. Some of these materials have been partially released, others remain inaccessible to this day, and when parts are revealed, but others remain hidden, the feeling that remains is not one of transparency, it's a selection process, as if only that which can be absorbed without causing major disruptions is permitted. And this creates a silent tension, because faith, by its very nature, rests on trust. But when information is limited, trust begins to share space with doubt. And perhaps that's the most delicate point of all. It's not just about what's hidden, it's about the impact it would have if it were fully visible. Because if there are already so many questions with so little knowledge, what would happen if everything were brought to light? But hold that thought for a second, because the next step in this story involves more than just what's being kept secret. It involves those who are actually allowed to get close to all of this, and that's where the difference between faith and access becomes even more evident. Now stop for a moment and think about this calmly. Up to this point, everything we've seen involves protected relics, restricted archives and controlled information. But there's one detail that completely changes how you see all of this, and almost no one talks about it. It's not just about what's hidden, it's about who can access, because the moment access to these relics and documents ceases to be universal and becomes limited to an extremely select group, history stops being just about faith. It becomes about privilege, and this is where things start to get even more uncomfortable. Throughout the centuries, access to certain Vatican relics has not only been restricted, it has been carefully controlled. It's not enough to want to see them. It's not enough to be interested. It's not even enough to be a scholar or researcher. In many cases, direct authorization is required. And not just any authorization. We are talking about specific permissions granted under criteria that are not always clear. Criteria that involve position, influence, institutional trust, and in some cases, even alignment with certain views. And this raises an inevitable question. If these relics are part of the history of faith, why does access to them depend on status? Because theoretically, faith has always been presented as something accessible to everyone, without distinction, without barriers, without a hierarchy of spiritual value. But when you observe how these relics are treated, the reality seems to follow a different path. There is an invisible separation. On one side, millions of people who believe, follow, and trust. On the other hand, there is a much smaller group that can actually see, access, study, and, in a way, interpret. And this difference creates a type of tension that is not easy to ignore, because it's not just about not being able to touch. It's about not being able to get close enough to understand. And when access is limited in this way, the narrative ends up being limited as well. Those who see, interpret. Those who don't see, believe what has been interpreted. And that places an enormous burden on those within that restricted circle, because in the end, these people are not just preserving relics. They are, in a way, mediating the relationship between the object and the meaning it carries. And perhaps that's exactly what bothers me the most, because the greater the distance between the public and these relics, the greater the dependence on an official version, and when only one version is accessible, other possibilities cease to exist, or at least they cease to be considered. And this becomes even more evident when rare but real accounts emerge of people who have managed to gain partial access to these environments. Some describe highly controlled experiences, others speak of unexpected limitations in accessible areas even within authorized access, as if there were levels within levels, layers. There's always another door, there's always another restriction, and this reinforces a feeling that at this point is starting to become familiar. The closer you get, the more you realize how far away you still are. But there's a point here that completely changes the game, because up until now, we've been assuming that these relics are exactly what they claim to be. We are starting from the premise that all of this revolves solely around access, control, and preservation. But what if there's another reason behind so much restriction? A reason that has nothing to do with protecting, but how do you prevent something from being questioned? Because the moment a relic ceases to be merely untouchable and begins to be truly analyzed, it stops being just a symbol. it becomes evidence, and evidence can be challenged. And it is precisely here that the story takes a turn that almost no one expects. And it is precisely here that everything changes level, because until now the question revolved around access, control, and privilege. But a possibility begins to emerge when you connect all these dots. A possibility that many people avoid considering precisely because it completely changes the meaning of everything. What if some of these relics aren't exactly what they claim to be? It might seem like a tough question, but it doesn't come out of nowhere. Throughout history, various relics associated with the Church have been the subject of intense debate. Experts have questioned dates, materials, origins, and even the circumstances in which certain objects appeared. In some cases, scientific analyses have yielded unexpected results. In others, ancient documents did not match the most widely accepted version, and yet, many of these relics continued to be treated as authentic, untouchable, indisputable. And this creates an extremely curious scenario, because when something cannot be touched, it also cannot be freely tested. When something cannot be analyzed comprehensively, it cannot be confronted. And when something cannot be challenged, it remains exactly as it was defined, regardless of any doubts, regardless of inconsistencies, regardless of the time. And perhaps that's the most delicate point of all, because if a relic is genuine, allowing analysis would only reinforce that. But if there is any room for doubt, any detail that doesn't fit perfectly, then keeping your distance is no longer just about protection, it becomes a strategy. And the more you observe this pattern, inaccessible relics, restricted archives, limited access, the more this hypothesis begins to gain traction. Not as a certainty, but it's a possibility that cannot be ignored. And that explains why some of these pieces remain surrounded by such strict rules, why contact is avoided, why access is filtered, why information is controlled. Because the moment a relic ceases to be merely a symbol and begins to be analyzed as historical evidence, it enters a completely different territory, a territory where questions cannot be avoided, where versions need to hold up, where faith meets inquiry. And it is precisely at this point that everything becomes more sensitive, because we're not just talking about antique objects. We are talking about things that underpin narratives, traditions, and interpretations that have spanned centuries. And any deeper questioning doesn't just affect the relic, it affects everything that has been built around it. And perhaps that's why, in many cases, the question is never fully answered. She is outlined, kept at a distance, dilute in incomplete explanations, or simply left aside. But the doubt remains, silent but present. And the more you realize this, the harder it becomes to ignore a specific feeling, the idea that we're not seeing everything, that there is a deeper layer to this story that doesn't reach the public, and not because it doesn't exist, but perhaps it cannot be fully exposed. Now hold that thought for a moment, because what comes next involves more than just doubts or theories. It involves something even more uncomfortable. There are cases in which the relics themselves have disappeared, been removed, or simply ceased to be mentioned, as if they had never been part of that history. And this is where the mystery ceases to be solely about what is hidden, and it becomes about what may have been erased. And this is where the story stops being merely strange and starts to get unsettling, because until now, everything revolved around what is hidden, protected, restricted. But there is a detail that completely changes the course of this narrative, a detail that involves not only access, but also absence, relics that simply disappeared without a clear explanation, without an official announcement, without a detailed public record. And when that happens, the question is no longer, why can't we play? It becomes, does that still exist? Over time, there are accounts of objects that were once mentioned in old records, described in historical documents, cited by scholars, and that, at some point, ceased to appear. They are not on display, they are not included in updated lists, they are no longer mentioned with the same clarity. It's as if they've been removed from the scene. And that opens up a different kind of doubt, because hiding something already raises questions. But when something disappears, the level of uncertainty is on another level. Where did he go? Who decided this, and why? In some cases, the explanation revolves around transfers, reorganization of collections, internal changes. But these answers are not always complete. They are not always detailed, and often they are not verifiable. And that's exactly where the discomfort increases, because when there isn't enough transparency, any absence becomes room for doubt. And what's most intriguing is that this doesn't happen with just any kind of relic. The pattern continues. Those that disappear, those that cease to be mentioned, those that seem to leave the scene, are usually linked to stories that are more sensitive, more controversial, and more difficult to explain, as if at some point their presence had ceased to be convenient. And this raises a possibility that is difficult to ignore. What if some of these relics weren't just hidden, but removed from the narrative? Because there is a huge difference between preserving something and deciding that it should no longer be part of visible history. And when you combine that with everything we've seen so far, restricted access, controlled files, doubts about authenticity, a much more complex picture begins to emerge. An image where it's not just access that's limited, but also what is allowed to continue existing in the public eye. And this leads to an even more delicate point. Because if something can disappear without a clear explanation, then what guarantees that everything we know today represents the complete picture? What guarantees that there aren't pieces, documents, records that have simply ceased to be part of the accessible version of history? And perhaps that's the most uncomfortable question so far. It's no longer about what's hidden, it's about what may have been removed, off, left behind. And the most curious thing is that even in the face of all this, the structure continues to function in the same way. The visible relics continue to be venerated, inaccessible sites continue to be protected, and those who are absent, they are simply not mentioned, as if they had never existed. But hold on to that for a moment, because after all of that, untouchable relics, secret files, restricted access, doubts about authenticity, and even disappearances, there is one last layer that connects everything. A layer that's not just in the relics, but in the way this whole story is presented to the world. And that's precisely where the most important question of all begins to take shape. And after all this, perhaps the most important question isn't about the relics. Perhaps it's about how this whole story reaches you. Because in the end, everything we've seen so far, relics that no one can touch, secret archives, restricted access, doubts about authenticity, and even disappearances, points to something bigger than isolated objects. It points to a system where not everything is visible, where not everything is accessible, and, most importantly, where not everything is questioned. And this is where the perception changes completely. Because while you're on the outside, seeing only parts of this story, there's an organized, structured, carefully presented version, a narrative that seems complete, but which, when observed closely, begins to show empty spaces, small gaps, details that are not explored in depth, questions that are not fully answered. And perhaps this doesn't happen by chance, because when you control what is shown, you also influence what is understood. And that doesn't necessarily mean that everything is wrong, but it raises an important possibility. What if what we know today is only part of the story, a selected portion, a filtered portion, a part that can be shown without causing major disruptions? Because think about it with me. If untouchable relics, inaccessible documents, and vanished records already exist, then it is impossible to say for sure that everything that matters is available, and that completely changes the way you view those structures, because it's no longer just about faith, tradition, or history, and it becomes about perspective, regarding how far you can see, and even where it's not allowed. And perhaps the most intriguing point of all is realizing that, even with so many questions, most people never get around to questioning them deeply, not for lack of interest, but because she was never encouraged to look beyond that. She was never prompted to notice these contradictions. She was never led to connect those dots. And that's exactly what makes this theme so powerful, because when you start to see those layers, it becomes impossible to go back to seeing everything the same way. Relics cease to be merely sacred objects. They become pieces within something bigger. Archives cease to be merely historical records. They become potential keys to questions that have not yet been fully explored. And the silence ceases to be merely an absence of information. It becomes part of the structure itself. But now I want to propose something different to you. After everything you've heard so far, don't try to jump to conclusions. Don't try to close this story. The question remains, because perhaps the most important thing isn't discovering a definitive answer, but to realize that it exists, and it remains open to this day. Now tell me something. After all, Of this, which of these possibilities made the most sense to you? Comment below with the word doubt. If you feel that there is still something that is not being fully shown, or protection, if you believe that all of this is just historical preservation. And if this type of content captivates you precisely because it makes you see beyond the obvious, go ahead and like and subscribe to the channel. Because in the next videos, we're going to continue exploring exactly those parts of history that are almost never clearly explained. Because the more we investigate, more questions arise. And if you've made it this far, it's because something in this video made you think differently. Perhaps it was a question that arose. Perhaps it was that feeling that there's something that isn't entirely clear. Or perhaps it was just that quiet discomfort of realizing that this story is deeper than it seems, and this doesn't happen by chance. So now I want to extend a direct invitation to you. If this video made you feel something, don't let this go. Subscribe to the channel now, because that's exactly the kind of content we're going to continue bringing you. Stories that aren't fully explained, relics that raise questions, and mysteries that almost no one delves into. And I want to know from you. Comment below with the phrase, "I perceived." If at any point during this video you felt that there is something more to it than what is shown, this type of comment isn't just interaction, it's what makes this content reach more people who are also starting to question things. And of course, don't forget to like the video. This helps much more than it seems to advance this type of investigation. And now, it doesn't end here. The next video is already playing on your screen, and in it, we delve even deeper into this story, exploring documents and decisions that may have changed everything, without almost anyone noticing. Click on it now, because the more you see, it becomes harder to ignore.